It's the balance breakdown, Tybura versus Spivac 2, and it's Graham McDonald alongside Spencer Kite here. It's a bit of a strange role for me. I'm usually the kind of, I get asked the questions and I don't host the show, but I give it my best. And strangely enough, after years of collaborating with Severe and being with Severe, I don't think we've ever done
I think this is the first time it's just been you and me.
Yeah, so it's about time. So yeah, it's good to have you, and it's good to be, well, I don't know if it's good to be hosting, but it's interesting to be hosting.
Yeah, I was gonna say it would have felt weird if I jumped on your platform and was like, hey, it's me, guy that isn't here anymore, filling in for everybody, and I've got the guy that runs the show sitting over here riding shotgun. So we'll make it work. We'll just kind of co-pilot this thing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, obviously these UFC Apex cards have come under a lot of criticism from the loud minority or maybe majority at this stage on social media. And I think, there's been talks of they're going to put money into it and kind of build it up and make it, more seats, more fans, more kind of a real show. But when you have a card like this with not much jeopardy and, a lot of decisions, especially maybe over in this side of the world where it's on in 4 or 5 in the morning, some of these cards are tough. I don't know what your feelings are on these Apex kind of lower tier cards that we seem to be getting a lot of recently.
Yeah, it's certainly more difficult for you guys over there given the time change and things like that. But I mean, as Harry and I talked about on the setup for this one, this is sort of the lowest stakes card we've had in a little bit of time. Certainly some athletes that I wanted to see, but even sitting through the nicest part of this was that it was just 10 fights. And so we kind of clipped along at a reasonable rate, even though we had 7 decisions out of 10 fights. We got a couple good performances, but to me, and Harry and I talk about this all the time, both online and off, of like, there's just tiers to these events now. And as long as I go into them saying, look, this is an Apex card, this is not a lot of jeopardy, as you said, let me just see the things that I want to see. Let me pick 2 or 3 athletes that I'm really interested in seeing. Let me see what I can pull away from these fights, but not coming at it from a position of the UFC has to wow me this weekend, because they're not going to wow me this weekend. That's just not going to, that wasn't what it was going to be. So we got a couple reasonable performances, a couple things that impressed me, a couple good takeaways, and we go from there and we move on to UFC 305 next week in Perth, which for me is a really interesting card. I like a lot of the fights on that card, like a lot of the people that are competing, especially on the main card. And so this is just kind of that Saturday placeholder of, I want to watch fights. I want to get some info on a couple of people, and let's go from there.
Yeah. Like, as you're talking there, I'm thinking, do you think, like, for me anyway, on my bubble that social media has created for me, it doesn't seem like the next week's card, the pay-per-view, Adesanya and Duplessis, has the same kind of buzz that it had, a year or even longer ago. And, sometimes a bit of breathing room in between fight cards. This card actually, in my opinion, maybe might hurt the upcoming pay-per-view. And obviously the UFC are making money and ESPN want these cards and all, but you obviously followed MMA for a long time, followed the UFC. Having like 3 weeks, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes a month in between fights maybe is, it's a bit excessive these days, but having a little break before a big pay-per-view gives time for the buzz to build. I don't know what the pay-per-view numbers are, but if some of these cards are making casual fans not see UFC cards as, essential viewing, and I can skip this one, I can catch it again, maybe it's just because we're in the bubble and we're going to watch these cards either way, and people will tune in for the pay-per-views. But maybe over time this is going to kind of damage the big pay-per-views. But I suppose on the other hand of it, the UFC are getting 500k, equivalent to 500k pay-per-view buys from ESPN, so they don't really mind. But I see a lot of people starting to kind of maybe speak up a little bit more about how they're kind of maybe getting into a bit of a rut as a long-term MMA fan with too many cards, and especially with cards like this. And yeah, you can pick out a couple of fighters that you say, I'm interested to see how how they're developing. But as we were saying, it's just nothing to write home about. If you're trying to sell this card as a big MMA fan to one of your friends, like, it's just, there's nothing on it. You don't have a hope, and I think that can become a problem over time. But maybe it's the UFC's in such a strong position with, you know, live sport being the best way for brands or TV brands and companies to sell advertising space to brands and things like that. So maybe it's just that the UFC have become such a strong force that they can afford to put on these cards and kind of just, you know, throw them together and not have any jeopardy and not have any meaning to them. And yeah, I'm kind of rambling here, but I think I think it does take away from these upcoming pay-per-views. I think there'd be a lot more hype if people had a bit of time to kind of build up the Adesanya Duplessis fight. Maybe it'll happen fight week. You know, sometimes we see a kickoff at a press conference, things like that, and I'm hoping that will happen. But yeah, I think maybe I'm nostalgic for the old days where we had a bit more time to get invested in these fights.
Yeah, I think space obviously gives you a little bit of room to really sort of recharge and dial into something. I know going into that event in Denver last month, we had the week off before, and it just felt nice to not have a Saturday where you were watching fights and to build in. Harry and I, again, to constantly reference the birthday boy from a couple days ago. Happy birthday, Harry. We constantly talk about it, about like sometimes you just like, it's okay to take a break. Like I say this all the time online of like, if you're not jazzed for the event, like press pause, do other things. Like even I do it, and I work in this space and earn my living by being present and being around. Now I don't take a ton of weekends off, but I pick and choose 3 or 4 throughout the course of the year to make sure that I'm getting some time in with family and getting some time away from sitting at my screens and staring at my television on a Saturday watching human beings beat the holy hell out of each other. But like the other part, I think, with the 305 fight card, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more as we get into the preview later on in the week, is that the momentum of that fight between Dricus and Izzy just died, right? Because Dricus wasn't ready to go right away when they wanted to do it last year in Sydney. Sean Strickland steps in, and next thing you know, it's a banana skin for Izzy. And Sean Strickland's the champion. And now they bring Izzy back to face Dricus. So obviously they have some tension between each other. But I know from talking to DDP ahead of this one, he was like, I don't want to get into all of the who's the real African thing, because it's ugly territory. I thought that stare down and that face off at UFC 290 got pretty gross in terms of what was being said back and forth. I think both sides kind of want to shy away from it a little bit. And it's just not as exciting as a fight right now as it was last summer when Izzy's coming off knocking out Alex Pereira, when he's back in the throne, and now he's coming in off a loss. So it just feels a little bit that to me feels like it's taken some of the momentum. Plus we're coming off 304 where we had 2 title fights, a bunch of people that we were really interested in. We've had a bunch of big events over the summer, and now we're sort of into the first one that doesn't have that same gravity as 304 and 303. And of course, not the same as 300. And so it's sort of diminished a little bit. But for me, it always comes down to, it's okay to pick and choose. Like everybody gets mad when Dana says, if you don't like it, don't watch. But like, that's that's reality. If there's stuff that you're not interested in, if you're not interested in a fight card, if you think it's not quality, it's cool to bounce for the weekend. I don't understand this expectation of, and like, listen, I know that everybody wants the UFC to deliver the highest quality every single weekend out. And it would be amazing if every fight card was of that sort of B grade level where you're always excited and there's always 3 or 4 fights with a bunch of jeopardy and divisional ramifications and things of that nature. But it's just hard to do in this day and age when they're pumping out 40 events a year and it's week after week after week, and pay-per-views are getting bigger and deeper and stronger overall compared to previous years. And so on those weeks like we had this past weekend, I mean, if I wasn't working, if I didn't earn a living from this space, I'd have been doing something else. And I think it's hard for people that love this sport and that follow this sport and have for years on end to hit that point where they're not as invested. And it kind of messes with you a little bit of like, but I'm supposed to watch the UFC. Like we're supposed to have an event. Now this is how I like to spend my Saturdays.
Yeah, I'm the guy who knows everything about the UFC. And,
right.
You know, yeah. So
and I don't know most of these guys. And how do I, yeah. And like, you want to be there for it and you want to see it, but you don't really care about it. So you just feel conflicted about, what am I supposed to do? Well, why don't they give me better? It's okay. This is what they're giving you. just go somewhere else.
Yeah, or stick a bunch of cash on
Or
on the fight to
or
make it interesting.
create some interest.
Yeah, so obviously we spent a bit of time talking about that, but the actual card itself, the main event, a rematch, Spivac versus Tybura, not really the rematch people were clamoring for, but I suppose at the lower end of the top 10 in the heavyweight division, it's probably a fight that makes sense. I think maybe
it's a classic Sean Sheehan fight. These are Sean's favorite heavyweight fights. 8 fights 9, 9 beats 8, 9 moves to 8, 8 moves to 9, and nothing really changes.
Yeah, and the heavyweight division has obviously never really been deep in the history of MMA, the history of the UFC. But I think maybe I'm being a bit harsh here, but I think the way this fight went, even the armbar finish was it just seemed like if you were watching and you didn't know, you would think these guys aren't high level. Like, how are these guys ranked 8 and 9? And I think the heavyweight division obviously over the years has been very, very top heavy, and it seemed to me though a few years ago that it was kind of developing, but it seems to have taken a big step back. Why do you think that is? Why do you think the heavyweight division that used to be the kind of the division that you could stick any 2 guys in the top 15 or in the top 10 as the main event, and you're kind of guaranteed that people will be interested, and you probably get a brawl or you get some kind of good fun fight. But recently I think a lot of these fights have been very low standard, and the heavyweight division just is in a really bad place at the moment.
I think it's gotten whittled down over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, really, probably even longer than that, dating back to sort of when we hit the Daniel Cormier, Stipe Miocic trilogy, and then Stipe fights Ngannou for a second time. Then Ngannou's got a bunch of time off, ultimately leaves the promotion. In that space where it was the same people fighting for the title, right? Stipe went 5 fights where he fought 2 guys, and it was spread out over like 3 years. In that time, we certainly had a bunch of emerging talents that were really interesting that we were all excited about. Tom Aspinall, Cyril Gane, Sergey Pavlovich. Curtis Blades was still relatively young and sticking around in that upper tier. Derek Lewis was still kind of in the mix. Volkov still in the mix. But in that time, all of these guys have kind of fought each other. And we've had it, instead of being a collection of 4 or 5 people that are interesting, it got whittled down to, well, we've got one and maybe another, right? Tom has obviously established himself as the best of that class, being the interim champion, being where he is now. Cyril Gane, we're not 100% sure of, won an interim title, loses to Ngannou, beats Sergey Spivac last year in Paris, has a fight coming up now. We'll see where he's still at. But everybody else has kind of been picked off, right? Sergey Pavlovich looked like he was going to be a contender. Well, he gets thrown in with Tom last year in New York. That goes the way it does. He loses his first fight after that to Alexander Volkov. So we've sort of been stuck with the same names at the top of the division. And here we are still sitting, waiting for another Stipe Miocic title fight that I don't know many people. Like, I don't know anybody that I speak to in the industry that is really excited about this fight. We're all excited to see what Tom Aspinall has to do going forward. And so it just takes a bunch of that steam out of it, where 4 or 5 years ago, 5, 6 years ago, we had some new names. Like, it's only 5 years ago that Jairzinho Rozenstruik shows up in the UFC and wins 4 fights in his rookie year, capped by that buzzer beater against Alistair Overeem, where he felt like, okay, who's this dude? And now 4 years later, he's sitting at number 12. He fights Tai Tuivasa next week in Perth. And it just feels like another one of these fights where it's like 2 guys with a number next to their name, but we know the ceiling that they have. So there's just not,
if you look
upside of these guys isn't there.
Yeah, if you look at them, like, usually you'd say, oh, give them time and stuff like that. But when you see, how good Cyril looked, and then how easily Jones beat him, you're just like, oof. if Aspinall or Jones goes against any of these guys, it's not going to last long. And obviously Stipe is kind of, what is he, 42 at the stage?
Yeah, 42 this month.
Yeah, so it's kind of now or never for that fight, and it probably is already too late. And obviously John Jones really wants to fight Stipe. Probably he thinks it's an easier fight, and Stipe's kind of the most title defenses of a heavyweight. So it does make sense for like a legacy thing, which Jones obviously must see as important. But yeah, the buzz that, you know, Tom Aspinall would versus Jones would bring would be absolutely huge. But you know, if Jones, for example, like this might not happen, but if Jones is to kind of go through him easily, then you know, where are we if Jones rides away into the sunset after beating Tom Aspinall, and then we're just left with now we're left with a division that's even kind of more downgraded.
Well, and like the state of things now actually makes me feel bad for a kid like Sergey Spivac, who's only 29, who has had relatively good success over the last, like, since his first fight with Marcin Tybura, he's been relatively successful. He's lost to two dudes, Tom Aspinall and Cyril Gane. And so normally you look at a 29-year-old in a division where 29 is still relatively young. He's showing a bunch of improvements. He's coming off, albeit a kind of surprised, and I'm sure Sean yelled armbar at his television watching it, surprising sort of finish, and feels like a really, you got caught in that kind of finish for a veteran guy like Tybura. But normally this would be a point where you're like, okay, let's see what this kid can do. But he's already been in there with the guys that you really have to beat in order to prove yourself. And I don't think anything has changed in 9 months since he fought, or 11 months since he fought Cyril Gane, or a couple of years since he fought Tom Aspinall. And so it feels like, sure, he moves forward with a win and it's a good victory, but he feels like he's capped. It feels like there's a limit to how far he's going to go. Now, I will certainly always be interested to see the next one, because maybe he does go out and beat a guy like Gelton Almeida. Maybe he does go out and face a guy like Curtis Blades, and we see a little bit more development, and that moves him a little bit further ahead even still. But it just kind of feels a little like heavyweight is getting to where middleweight was for a number of years, where it's just the same people over and over and there's no real movement.
Yeah. So on the actual fight itself, obviously you gave a brief kind of synopsis of it there. Is there anything, you know, to take from it? Do you actually think Spivac has made improvements, or do you just think it was, you know, these two guys fight each other 10 times, one of them probably going to win 5 or 6 times, and the other one's probably going to win 4 or 5 times? I think maybe the slight improvements from Spivac, but you can only beat what's in front of him as well. So
I think he's made
him after a dominant win.
Yeah, I think he's made improvements over the last couple of years as he's gotten older, as he's settled into life in Las Vegas and getting set up there, especially. And I think we saw that through the Augusto Sakai fight, through the Derek Lewis fight. And look, you go out against Cyril Gane and you lose. As Harry would say, these things happen in MMA. But he also, like, pressured Cyril Gane in that fight. And if you remember back to it, Gane looked very uncomfortable. He wanted no part of messing with this kid in the grappling exchanges. And so I think there is improvement, certainly from the guy that we saw early in his UFC career. What I'm interested to see going forward is there another jump? Is there another level up that's coming? He got right out there, understood that Marcin Tybura is historically a slow starter. Best time to get him is early. Tybura's talked about it in the past. Let me get out here. Let me get right on him, hit him with a good shot early, initiated the grappling exchanges, and then just went to work. And so I think there's growth. I want to see if there's going to be more growth in the future.
Yeah. And in the co-main event, Damon Jackson and Mariscal, obviously it went to a decision like a lot of the fights did, but I thought this was a pretty good fight. What did you make of it?
Yeah, I mean, thoroughly entertaining fight. Damon Jackson is hell on wheels for the first round, and then it starts going, the energy meter starts dropping after that. Chepe Mariscal is a great story to me through the last year and change now. A guy that did a lot of work on the regional circuit. If you go back and look at his Tapology, fought a lot of guys that got to the highest levels and just never quite got there. Gets the short notice call last year. He's now 4-0 in the UFC. Comes out, dominates this fight, 30-25 twice, 30-26 once. If not for missing weight on Friday, this is a blowout performance where he's probably the person we're talking about the most. I think it should still set him up for a step up in competition. He was supposed to face Dan Ige on this card prior to, or last month, prior to Ige jumping in to the fight with Diego Lopez on 4 hours notice. I think he's in line for a fight like that. You go 4-0 in the UFC in the featherweight division, and I know this was a catchweight fight, but at 45, generally speaking, give him a top 15 guy. Find somebody in there, or give him a guy. This is, to me, feels like Nathaniel Wood fought a couple weeks ago. Chepe just won here. That feels like a similar timeline. Let's see what's going on there. I know Nate has a bunch of stuff going on with his daughter that obviously we want to make sure she's healthy and he's in the right headspace to fight. But something along that lines of somebody just outside the top 15 or just inside it feels merited for Chepe at this point.
Yeah, he's definitely got a good momentum going. You know, usually I'd kind of be critical of a guy missing weight, and I do believe that it kind of gives a big advantage when you don't, you know, nearly kill yourself to make those extra whatever it is in the specific case. But on short notice coming in here, I don't think I think the performance is so dominant that he just showed he was the better fighter all around, and it wouldn't have mattered. But obviously for Jackson, you know, a lot of these guys, I've seen them up close and personal. You've seen them up close and personal. They really sometimes kill themselves to make that weight, and that extra 1 or 2 pounds that people might think is nothing is a big ask to get rid of. You know, so yeah, I think, you know, when you're coming in on short notice, it's a different story, and I think, you know, you can kind of let this one go because I don't think it really affected the fight outcome. I think you could see on the night that he was just, you know, there's just levels, and he was just a better level.
Yeah, I agree. And I mean, if you saw Friday, Chepe's a guy that, as I said, is a professional. He's had 20 some odd fights, not somebody that notoriously misses weight. He pushed himself on Friday to make that weight, and they basically just said, like, look, man, you got to give it up. You can't keep doing this. You're going to have to take the penalty if we go forward. He said in his post-fight, he was embarrassed to come out there and compete. He didn't think Damon Jackson in his camp was going to take it. He was happy that they did. And so this isn't one, and we've got one a little later on in the main card, where it feels like, what are we doing here? Like none of us expected you to make that weight, so why were you signing? Chepe generally makes the weight. I think he's fine going forward. And as you said, hard to penalize him too much after a performance like that.
I'm going to absolutely butcher this name. Veretenikov, is it?
Nailed it.
Really?
Aced it.
Doubt it. But obviously he took on Danny Barlow. There was a bit of a kind of there was one scorecard here. One judge gave all 3 rounds against Barlow. The other 2 gave the first 2 to Barlow. How did you see this?
I had Danny Barlow winning. Obviously, it's a little difficult for me to score at home as I'm doing recaps and things of that nature. But to me, it felt, when I heard the 30-27, it didn't make sense to me. Like, it was
exactly. It was like, what?
And like, to be fair, it's a competitive fight, right? This isn't a fight where Danny Barlow clearly, handily, demonstratively won all 3 rounds or 2 out of 3 rounds.
The first round, though, I think the first round is, maybe I'd have to watch it back, and maybe, you know, you can miss one big impactful strike, and
100%.
But I was like the first round. Oof.
It felt like 2-1 Danny Barlow to me. So 29-28 feels legitimate, and when 2 of the other officials turn in that score, it's like, oh, this feels right to me. The official that turned in the 30-27, Jaron Villel, happens to be a friend of mine, a guy that I know a little bit, guy that helped award me my judging certificate from John McCarthy's command program. So that now makes me question my own credentials a little bit, but it was a strange score. I didn't expect to see a 30-29 Veretetnikov, but here we are. Danny Barlow gets another victory, remains undefeated. He's dialed back the crazy part of what, and I can't remember who it was that I saw on Twitter, and I forgive me for not remembering, that said, like, part of the enjoyment of Danny Barlow is that he's a madman, and he goes out there and he just goes 100 all the time. And now he's gotten rid of that, and he's probably better for it, but he's not as fun to watch. And that's kind of what this fight felt like. He's usually a guy that's hunting that big left hand, the left hand to God. Didn't hunt it as much. Was a little more poised, was a little more controlled, got a good win, continues to move forward undefeated, but not necessarily the performance in the fight we expected from him.
Yeah, even in the Josh Quinlan fight, he kind of was maybe making a conscious effort to try and be less wild and be more kind of composed. But we and Sean have talked about on the main podcast with Derek Lewis and maybe Johnny Walker over the years. Sometimes trying to be technical takes away from what actually makes you the most dangerous. Like, obviously, you'd like to strike a balance here, but
sometimes you have to be a mad bastard. If that's just your character, like, if that's the way you do and that's how things go best, sometimes you have to just do it.
It's also, obviously, it's good to get the rounds in and to show you can go the distance when needs be, or when things aren't working out and you don't want to overthrow your shots and things like that. But sometimes I hope these guys don't get, you know, a Lando Venata coming in doing this crazy stuff against Tony Ferguson and then kind of trying to become like a generic fighter and just kind of trying to round himself out too much and taking away from what made him so exciting and so dangerous. And, you know, I hope Barlow continues to be a bit of a wild man going forward.
Harry and I talk about it with Arnold Allen all the time. Like part of where Arnie is the best is when he is just a little bit of a crazy bastard and he just stops trying to be technical and fundamentally sound and work behind the jab and throw the long 1-2 and things like that. And he just goes out there like he did against Dan Hooker and says, well, I'm blind in one eye, so I may as well just throw everything at him. That's when he's at his best. Sure, he got the win against Giga a couple of weeks ago. Looked good doing it. Right game plan, right approach, all like that. But I think he's actually best when he's just a bit of a lunatic. Sometimes that's what we need. So Danny Barlow, get back to being a bit of a lunatic.
And maybe that's what's being a bit selfish. Maybe he's like, I'm trying to go undefeated. I'm trying to get to the top here. But like, you know, we need some.
We want some mad bastards.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, good performance there. Bit of a strange scorecard as we talked about there. This decision, but this was in a run of decisions, and the Gutierrez Lee fight before that. Obviously, it was a pretty good fight as well. Like, you know, on a not so great card. There actually was a couple of pretty good fights, and this was one of them. Gutierrez obviously got the decision here, deserved in my opinion. How did you see the fight?
Yeah, deserved for sure, but also to me kind of feels like the limitation of Chris Gutierrez. Like, understand that it's short notice. A guy that you're absolutely not preparing for was supposed to face Javid Basharat, who is a more well-rounded, more established sort of competitor than Quang Li, who jumps in on short notice. But Chris Gutierrez for me is a guy that I always come away wanting more, even when he wins in spectacular fashion as he did, knocking out Frankie Edgar a bunch of years ago. I always come away going, I just need to see more. And if you listen to the commentary watching the fight, that's sort of what the broadcast team was saying, is like, it's great that you come out here and bash away low kicks and cut down these people all the time. And Gutierrez does a great job at it. I believe they said during the broadcast that he's up to second all time in the UFC in terms of landed low kicks behind Ioana Jędrzejczyk. Great. Give me some more to it. Add something to it. Throw some high kicks in there. Show me a little more urgency. Show me a little more aggression. Because this felt like a fight against a short notice opponent who's making his debut, where you can potentially go out and just style on them. You can go out and have that big victory that gets you moving forward again after losing last time out to Song Yadong. And instead, it's a much more competitive fight than I thought it would be. And you go into the third round 1-1 against a guy that 10 days ago wasn't in the UFC. And so that doesn't convince me. And he said afterwards, like, I wanted to show this guy that he's running his mouth, that he's going to knock me off. And there's levels to this. You don't step to the big dogs when you've never been here before. And it's like,
seemed to be prepared, didn't it?
Dude, it was 1-1. Like, yes, you won the third round and you did what you needed to do in the final 5 minutes, but like, this wasn't a blowout and you probably should have blown him out. And so be interested to see where he goes next. He feels like somebody that's going to cycle into that veteran facing the emerging talent group. And so we'll see who he gets next.
Yeah, and obviously another decision before that, Yana Santos and Chelsea Chandler. You know, this fight, just not very high level fight. I don't, you know, obviously when that was the ninth fight of Chelsea Chandler's career. You know, rushing somebody's fight, maybe in the future with a bit of, you know, seasoning and experience, she might be, you know, a hard fighter.
Nope, you're being too nice.
Bit of a grinder.
You're being too nice.
She has a long way to go, is what I'm going to say, and she shouldn't be in the UFC at this stage. Maybe, you know, with the right fight, she can be competitive, but at the moment, it's just not good enough, really.
I mean, the struggle is that she's 30 years old already. She can't make this. She can't make bantamweight. This was booked at 135. She hasn't made the 135-pound limit. Missed last time out against Josiane Nunez. Misses egregiously here by 5 pounds against Yana Santos. She just can't fight at this weight class. And when that's a thing that you're up against every single time out, you have to just be honest about it. And so PFL's got 45. Invicta will book 45 fights for you. And if not, that's like, I talked to her before this fight and we talked about the weight miss last time out. I said, look, we have to talk about it. It's obviously a thing. She said, yeah, it sucks, but this is what I have to do to be at this level. Seeing her miss on Friday, I wanted, you know, I sit here and go, well, you didn't do it. Like, you didn't do the thing. And so whether it's, there's different sacrifices you have to make, there's more sacrifices you have to make, or you have to be realistic with yourself that this isn't where you're meant to be. You have to fight at 45. And if the UFC isn't going to do the 45-pound weight class, which they're clearly not doing, we haven't had a fight at women's featherweight this year, then you got to move on. And that sucks because everybody wants to be in the UFC and say, I'm a UFC fighter. But that's your reality, because she didn't look like she belonged, regardless of weight class. That's the other piece of this. Skill-wise, talent-wise, execution-wise, she didn't look like she belonged in there. Now, granted, Yana Santos has been around forever, veteran, lots of experience, looked good in this fight, best she's looked since welcoming her daughter with Thiago Santos. But like, Chelsea Chandler is just somebody that doesn't belong at this level.
Yeah, another problem that arises as well when she's below the level, trying to get to the level, is the weight, because how much of her camp and how much is actually spent on trying to make 100%. The weight. You know, it's just really obviously, as you said, being a UFC fighter is very important to it's their dream. They always they started wanting to be in the UFC, but you know, you could go elsewhere, come back at a different time in your career when you're more developed, when you're able to make the weight and, you know, kind of show what you're really made of. But as you're kind of hinting at there, I just don't see it happening. I don't think, you know, I never really say, oh, somebody really shouldn't be in the UFC, and you know, if you get offered the fight, you're gonna take it, obviously. But I think, you know,
and I try not to as well. But like sometimes even me, the happy, you know, ray of sunshine, has to acknowledge. And to your point of how much of camp is spent just worrying about being able to make 35, which again, unsuccessfully 2 times in a row. That's where, to me, and listen, I'm not somebody that cuts weight. I'm not somebody that's ever cut weight. And I'm sure a lot of people that do this professionally will look at me and be like, yeah, you're not one to talk here, man. Okay, but I didn't sign up to be a professional fighter that's going to compete at a designated weight. If that's the number you're supposed to make, you got to do whatever it takes year-round, life-wise, to be able to make it. And if you can't, you have to accept that. That's just where we're at. In honor of Harry not being here, I will say the obvious: weight cutting sucks. Let's fucking do away with it. It's stupid. But this is the world we live in terms of this sport. If you can't make the weight, what are we doing?
Yeah, it's very true. Obviously, we had a finish in the fight before that, which was good. Kazama and Gregorio, nice triangle choke here. Were you impressed with the performance of Kazama, or what's your impression?
I mean, I was impressed with the ability to recover pretty quickly. So he comes out in the first round, out grapples Harlampus Gregorio, looks like he's in complete control. Gregorio comes out to start the second, swinging for the fences, connects, puts Kazama on the ground, bashes him with some big elbows that feel like if he can land maybe 1 or 2 more, he's getting a stoppage, but he's exhausted. So he has to sort of come down into top position and just take that breather. And as he does, Kazama throws up the triangle choke. And I mean, as soon as he slides the arm across, Gregorio is tapping. Just combination of exhaustion and I'm dead to rights. The ability to withstand that punishment and stay lucid and stay to a point where you understand, okay, he's here. If I do this, we're out of here. Those are little things that I like seeing in relatively inexperienced fighters, as Toshiomi Kazama is. Is he going anywhere in the bantamweight division? Probably not beyond this range of guys. But if you want to give me somebody that's aggressive, gets into these kind of fights, 2 fights in the UFC now, or 3 fights in the UFC now, all of them have ended inside the distance. We've been talking the last several weeks about the number of decisions we've been getting. You want to give me an all-action fighter like this? Sign me up. Congrats on the first UFC win.
I kind of enjoyed this fight. You know, obviously he came off two KO losses, and it was kind of make or break. It was kind of looking like it was going the same way, and the way he pulled it out of the flames. You know, it was a big moment for him, and
there's no shame in losing to Rinya Nakamura.
Yeah, but there's probably a difference between having a UFC career, continuing 100%. A UFC career, and not. And it definitely looked like, as you were saying, it looked like he might have been a couple of shots away from it. And we've seen guys, especially after they've come off, you know, big losses like that, you know, kind of deja vu and kind of let it happen. And he definitely, you know, fought for his life, and it was must have been a big betting odds comeback if you were betting live on that one.
Yeah, certainly a point there where if he wanted an exit, he could have found it. He could have taken it. Yeah. And I mean, you feel a little bit gutted for Gregorio, right? He's probably looks at that and goes, man, I needed just 2-3 more shots. The referee was getting in there, looking close, and it ended up being the way it was. So this is why we watch. This is the fun of it.
Yeah, and obviously there was the prelims. There wasn't much on it. Carol Rosa, Pani, yeah, another not great decision. I don't know. The Dennis Williams fight was a bit. I expected more from Carl Williams in that fight. Zalal was probably the highlight of the prelims with his rear naked choke win after a really nice piece of grappling, and obviously the opening fight wasn't up to much either. But yeah, Luciano and Alcenkar. I'm probably butchering names here, but was there anything on the prelims that really kind of stood out to you?
I mean, I liked Carol Rosa's win just from the fact that we saw her go 15 minutes at a good clip. She had that fight with Irina Aldana last time out where she started well, wins the opening round, batters the lead leg, and then just doesn't have the gas to continue pressing and pursuing Irina Aldana, who fights her way back into the fight and ends up winning the decision. So for her to go out and put 15 heavy minutes on Pani Kianzad, beat up those legs, bust her up on the feet, good performance. Somehow still only 29. I don't necessarily think that we're going to be making a big run in the division, but this is a division of bantamweight for the women where another good win. If she goes out and faces somebody like Yana Santos, she goes out and faces somebody like Macy Chasson next, she can be right in that mix because it only takes a couple of good wins. So this is a good step in the right direction, excuse me. Stephanie Luciano in the opener, impressed just from the fact of how much she's grown since the last time she faced Talita Alankar. These two fought on Dana White's Contender Series last summer, battled to a draw. She then comes out. So Luciano won the third round of that fight 10-8 to force the draw. Alankar, World Jiu-Jitsu World Champion, won the first 2 rounds. Luciano rallies back, earns the draw, and then picked up where she left off on Saturday. Just took the fight to her. You could see the confidence. You could see the improvement. You could see the greater understanding of her range and her reach advantage. Played to that well. 24, always going to be interested in seeing somebody like that continue to grow. Just give her time. Let's just see. No projections of how great she could be, but let's just see. But the star was
needs the right matchups.
Definitely 100%. 8 fights into her career. Like, let's just be slow with this. But the absolute star of the prelims is Yusuf Zalal, who just in 2 fights back in the UFC now this year goes out and submits Billy Q the first time around on short notice, and then just dominates this fight. As soon as he gets Jono Aarons to the ground, he's on the back, he's hooks in, he's body lock around the midsection, and he's grabbing that choke. And Aarons is tapping before it's even under the neck. Like, he just understands, I'm stuck here. He's on my chin. I'm getting my face cranked off. Let's just go home. Zalal is a guy to me that got to the UFC too early. Then he had a bunch of success because he goes out and beats 3 guys in, I think, 8 months. And he looks really good, but they're all fellow guys that came up through the Contender Series, limited experience, limited amount of competition that's, of the UFC level. And then he starts getting in there with some guys that have a little bit more experience, including welcoming Ilia Topuria to the UFC. And he goes on a 4-fight stretch without a victory. He gets bounced. He's looked so much better since. 5 straight wins overall, all finishes. He's 27 now. Feels like he's ready to be here. I don't know if there's comparisons in football or things like that where it's somebody that comes up a little early, needs to go play in a lower league, and then comes back and is ready to go the second time around. But that's what he feels like to me, as a guy that the first cup of coffee was okay. We saw the promise. Now he's ready to be here full time. And I give him to me, he's a guy that it's like, let's just give him another one of these. Let's just give him a top 15 matchup. If you want to do Chepe Mariscal, they're on the same sort of timeline, same division. That sounds good to me. He was talking about Ige. He was talking about a bunch of the guys that have fights already sort of in the books or just coming off fights, but he's in that range. And Alex Caceres, Chepe, Lerone Murphy, somebody in that range, because he's looked really good since coming back.
Yeah, I think he even mentioned Alex Caceres in the post fight interview that would be a fight. You know, Caceres is a bit of a wild card. You don't really know what you're going to get. A bit inconsistent, but definitely a good test. And Salal, he's somebody who impressed me as you kind of hinted at there on his first run, but he definitely was a bit too raw. And sometimes the media and the fans kind of think it's a be all and end all if you get cut from the UFC or you leave the UFC, but sometimes that bit of less pressure to kind of give yourself time and get your confidence and momentum back. Things like that we've seen it before where guys just aren't ready, and the people probably take a while to sit up and take notice again. But that's probably perfect for the situation he's in. He's still a young guy, he's still improving, and as he said himself, he's enjoying it again, which is a huge thing when you have to go into training 2-3 times a day. If you're not enjoying it, it becomes a real drag. If it's all pressure and no fun, then it's a much more difficult path then. And so I think he seems to have kind of got a breath of fresh air being outside the UFC, and it seems to have served him very well.
He talked about reading his own press clippings a little bit the first time around, right? He gets those 3 wins and he looks really good, and everybody's high on him, and this guy's a future contender in the division, and you're 23, 24 years old and flying high in the UFC, and you're 3-0 and you're looking great, and you suddenly start thinking that you're the best thing ever. And he's acknowledged it. Like, I got pretty high on my own supply. Like, I was into myself, and then I face Ilia Topuria and he gets me. And then I face Sungwoo Choi and he manages to beat me. And then I'm facing Sean Woodson and we get a close fight. And then and he just, he tried to figure things out with the 3-fight losing streak. He goes down to bantamweight. That's a tough weight cut for him. He's a big kid. I saw him in Denver. Big kid. He's not small for the division by any stretch. And so he, as you said, needed that time to sort of get bounced from the UFC, deal with that frustration, deal with that disappointment, make some changes, reassess, regroup. And here he is, 2 wins this year, looking great doing it.
Yeah, definitely. He's definitely one I'm excited about to see where he goes. Maybe he won't go all the way, but I see him being in a lot of exciting fights going forward. The only one we didn't really touch on, I suppose, is the Denise and Carl Williams fight. I thought, from Carl Williams' perspective, he only really went to the wrestling properly when he was completely rocked in the 3rd round and he got the takedown. And it's like, where was this for the first 2 rounds? You're getting lit up you're throwing these loopy shots, you're getting hit with straight shots, you're getting lit up, and he just kind of took it for 2.5 rounds until he couldn't take it anymore.
You're facing a kickboxer and you're letting him kickbox. What are we doing?
And even when you're half out, you're basically stunned, you're able to get him down. So it's like, well, and even the corner work and the lack of urgency at the end when he was on top, it's like, you need to make something happen now. And he's doing a bit of ground and pounding, but you want to win this fight or what?
Yeah, and it's tough, right? Both these guys are relatively inexperienced when it comes to their MMA careers. Carl Williams has had some success prior to this fight in the UFC, and it's been through that wrestling. And so to see him not go to it and not show some even a modicum of urgency to get into grappling exchanges, like, I think we all sort of know Jonathan Denise is a guy that is a kickboxer, comes from Glory. All he's looking to do is stand and trade. And if you're going to let him do it, he's going to win that 9 times out of 10. And that's pretty much how this played out. Like, this felt like it could have been a very different fight if Carl Williams decides to wrestle a little more. Be interested to see what the corner has to say, what the rebound is for him coming out of this. Because I think for a few people, he was somebody that in that heavyweight mix, to sort of circle it back to what we started on, was somebody that, not that anybody saw as a future contender, but just an interesting new addition, right? 3 wins in his first 3 starts in the UFC, a little bit of wrestling credentials, a little bit of wrestling background. Let's see what he can do. And then to go out and have a performance like this sort of stifles all of that.
Yeah, he's really got, like, when wrestling is kind of a deficit that a lot of heavyweights have, and especially a kickboxer, to make him even in the first round, to make him even worried about the takedown has to be in the game plan. Like, it's actually like malpractice by the camp if it isn't. And maybe he got hit with a couple of shots and the game plan kind of went out the window, but from the corner work in between rounds, it didn't seem they should be screaming at him here. You need to put the grappling together. You need to make this guy worried. You need to stop getting punched in the face. Like, this is just I was just a really, really bad fight IQ or really, really bad game plan, or both. But Yeah, I agree with you. Like if he fights to his strengths, he'll definitely be a good test for a lot of up and coming heavyweights. But if he goes out and fights with that kind of game plan, it's only going to go one way, I think.
Yeah, not a guy that should be out there getting into striking exchanges and trading with people. He needed Safe Saud in his corner, getting in his ass, telling him all the way in, all the way out. Get this to the ground, calling him an MF or in between rounds. Shouts to the general.
Thanks a million for joining me, Spencer. I'm pretty sure Harry will be back next week. Normal service will be resumed, hopefully, and I won't be making a botched attempt at hosting the show. But
you did exceptionally well.
I really appreciate you joining me, and yeah, thanks to everybody for tuning in and like and subscribe and all that stuff, and follow Spencer. Can you try
at Spencer Kite on social media?
Perfect. Thanks a million for joining me, and we'll see you soon.